Scarface was made in the early 80s in New York, mostly. And New York films tend to have this characteristic of grittiness, kind of realism, especially New York films from that time. And even though I happen to know that a couple of the people who worked on the sound for Scarface had recently worked on Apocalypse Now, because I worked on that film with them, they didn't, they certainly weren't trying to make that movie with Al Pacino sound like Apocalypse Now, because it's a completely different kind of a story. They kept the kind of gritty, ugly reality sound that you expect from that kind of situation. I think De Palma and other New York directors from that period were certainly making certain kinds of films, and the films tended to be about realistic subjects, about modern, ugly reality, and mostly in urban situations. And Scarface is, right there at the top in terms of that kind of style. One of the things that we needed to make sure of when we were collaborating on the Scarface game was that it all sounded real. It could be a kind of exaggerated version of reality, but none of it could sound like science fiction. And in some cases, as we were designing the sounds for the guns, for instance, I was tempted to put a kind of maybe ricochet or kind of a sound in for an initial gunshot, just to give it a little more character. And then when we tried that by putting it into the game format, it sounded a little too sci-fi. And so we took those out and pulled ourselves back to a more kind of realistic, exaggerated but realistic sound. In terms of exaggeration, I could start with an explosion that we did that's used in several places in the video game. I think the first place that we see it or hear it is when a whole wall collapses because of a series of gunshots or an explosion, a secondary explosion. And an explosion that you would expect would cause a wall to fall down, you would think would be kind of a medium-sized explosion. But in fact, we used sounds that were much, much bigger than that in order to get the kind of drama out of it that we wanted in that moment. Scarface is the first video game that I've done the sound for, and I think from this first experience, my impression is that the main difference between film sound and video game sound is a technological difference. At this point, the technology of video game sound is not quite up to the technology of film sound. I think that'll probably change soon. Other than that, I think the two art forms are very similar. When you're designing the sound for the video game, you're thinking in terms of character, who is this character who we're hearing all of these sounds associated with? How can I push the story a little farther by using sound? What should Tony be hearing from moment to moment, and what should the audience or the player be hearing? I think of all of those same things when I'm doing the sound for a film. I think that this concept of point of view, the point of view of the characters, which has been explored very thoroughly in movies, I think is going to be explored maybe even further in video games. And the character of Tony Montana is about as good an example as I can think of, because you have this guy with a very identifiable point of view who has, character shooting out the top of his head, and you get a lot of that from sound, not only from the sound of his voice, but from the sound of his environment and the sound of the weapons that he shoots. He hears those sounds himself, and as you hear them, you associate the power of the weapons with him, And you just can't help but learn a lot about the character of Tony Montana by hearing these sounds. It can be a little frustrating sometimes when you're feeding sounds initially into a video game and exploring what sounds are going to work and what sounds aren't going to work. It's the length of time that it takes to get them in. When I'm working on a film, I have the visuals for the film in front of me, and I can more or less instantly match a sound with those visuals and see whether it's going to work or not. When you're working in a video game, sometimes it takes several minutes between when you initially feed the sound into the game and when you can hear that sound matched with the visual image that you want it to be matched with, and that's pretty frustrating. I think the biggest limitation for doing sound for a video game is technical. The sampling rates that we're dealing with in terms of sound are about half of what we're used to working with in film, and that just means that the sound quality is lower. It's not going to sound as good, as sharp, as clean, and in the end, unfortunately, it doesn't sound quite as powerful as we would like it to. But fortunately, the technology is headed in a good direction, and I think this next generation of video games, the sound is going to be very similar to what you hear in a movie.